20 years after a sudden goodbye, a chance encounter in a Prague hotel room proves that some connections are too strong to stay lost forever. The hotel room felt smaller than usual. David loosened his tie and threw it on the chair by the window. Another long day of meetings was finally over. The business deal he came to Prague for was taking longer than expected. Numbers, contracts, and handshakes. It all felt like a blur now. He kicked off his black leather shoes and wiggled his toes. The carpet felt soft under his feet. Outside, the city lights were starting to flicker on. Prague looked beautiful from the 7th floor, but he was too tired to appreciate it properly. His phone buzzed with messages from his office back home, but he ignored them. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more paperwork, more decisions. For now, he just wanted to rest. The room was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioner. David walked to the mini fridge and grabbed a bottle of water. The cool liquid felt good against his throat. He had been talking all day, explaining charts and graphs to people who seemed more interested in their phones than his presentation. Just as he was settling into the comfortable armchair, a soft knock came from the door. It was gentle, almost polite, not like the loud banging he expected from room service or hotel staff rushing through their duties. David looked through the peephole and saw a woman standing in the hallway. She had a cleaning cart beside her and wore the standard hotel uniform, a neat blue dress with a small name tag. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she seemed to be waiting patiently. He opened the door, expecting the usual quick exchange about towels or sheets. But something was different about this woman. She looked at him with eyes that seemed to sparkle with recognition, even though he was certain they had never met before. "Good evening," she said in English with a slight accent that made her words sound musical. "I need to restock your towels and check the bathroom supplies." Without waiting for his response, she stepped into the room with quiet confidence. Her movements were smooth and purposeful, like someone who had done this job many times before. But there was something else, a familiarity in the way she moved around his space that caught his attention. She slipped off her work gloves and placed them neatly on her cart. Her hands were small but looked strong, like someone who worked hard but took care of herself. She began organizing the fresh towels, folding them with practiced ease. David found himself watching her more closely than he usually watched hotel staff. There was something about the way she hummed quietly while working, the way she seemed completely comfortable in his room, that made him curious. "Have we met before?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. She turned around and smiled. It was not the polite smile he usually got from hotel workers. This was genuine, warm, and somehow knowing. Her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, and for a moment, David felt like he was looking at someone from a half-remembered dream. "I was thinking the same thing," she replied, tilting her head slightly as she studied his face. "You look very familiar to me." The way she said it made David's heart skip a beat. Not in a romantic way, but in the way you feel when you almost remember something important, but cannot quite grasp it. Like when you hear a song from years ago and can almost remember where you first heard it. She continued her work, replacing the used towels with fresh ones and checking that everything was properly stocked. But she kept glancing at him as if trying to solve a puzzle. David found himself doing the same, studying her profile, the way she moved, the sound of her voice. "Are you from Prague?" he asked, genuinely curious now. "Born and raised," she said with pride in her voice. "I grew up not far from the city center." "What about you?" "You are American, yes?" "Yes, from Chicago. But I have been to Prague before, actually. Many years ago, when I was much younger." She paused in her work and turned to face him completely. The smile on her face grew wider, and David could see genuine interest in her eyes. Not the polite interest of someone being paid to be friendly, but real curiosity. "When were you here before?" she asked. "It was about 20 years ago. I was a college student, part of an exchange program. I only stayed for a few months, but I loved every minute of it." Something changed in her expression. The puzzle pieces in her mind seemed to be moving, trying to fit together. She set down the towel she was holding and looked at him more intently. 20 years ago, she repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "You were a student here." David nodded, feeling that same strange pull of almost memory. "I lived in the university dormitories. I was taking Czech language classes and trying to learn about European business practices. It was supposed to be a full-year program, but I had to leave early because of a family emergency." The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she took a small step closer. "You left suddenly," she said, and it was not a question but a statement. "Yes," David said, surprised by her certainty. "My father got very sick and I had to fly home immediately. I barely had time to pack my things and say goodbye to anyone." They stared at each other for a long moment, both feeling the weight of something important hanging in the air between them. The hotel room seemed to fade away, and David felt transported back to those exciting days when he was young and everything seemed possible. "What was your favorite place in Prague?" she asked softly. "There was this little coffee shop near the university. They had the best pastries, and the owner always tried to help me practice my Czech. And there were these hidden courtyards that most tourists never found, peaceful places where you could sit and watch the world go by." Her smile grew even brighter, and she nodded as if she knew exactly which places he meant. "I think," she said carefully, "we have more to talk about than just towels." The woman finished folding the last towel and placed it carefully on the bathroom counter. She moved with the same quiet grace, but David could see that her mind was working, trying to piece together memories that seemed just out of reach. "My name is Elena," she said, turning back to face him. "I should have introduced myself properly." "David," he replied, extending his hand for a handshake. When their hands touched, he felt a jolt of familiarity that he could not explain. Her handshake was firm and warm, exactly like someone he might have known well once upon a time. Elena did not let go of his hand immediately. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face with growing wonder. "David," she repeated, as if testing how his name felt in her mouth. "You know, I had a friend named David once, a long time ago." She released his hand and sat down on the edge of the bed without asking permission. It was a casual, comfortable gesture that spoke of old friendship, rather than the formal distance between a hotel guest and staff member. "Tell me more about your time here," Elena said, her work temporarily forgotten. "What did you study? Where exactly did you live?" David found himself sitting in the armchair across from her, drawn into the conversation in a way that surprised him. Usually he kept interactions with hotel staff brief and polite, but with Elena, talking felt as natural as breathing. "I was studying international business, but I was also taking Czech language classes because I wanted to understand the culture better," he began. "I lived in those old dormitory buildings near Wenceslas Square. The rooms were tiny, but the location was perfect." Elena's eyes lit up with recognition. "Those old brick buildings with the green doors? The ones where all the exchange students stayed?" "Exactly those ones," David said, leaning forward in his chair. "The heating never worked properly and the showers were always cold, but we did not care. We were young and everything felt like an adventure." "I remember those buildings well," Elena said with a soft laugh. "I used to visit there often. My university was nearby and I had friends in the exchange program. I was studying literature, but I loved meeting students from other countries. Everyone had such interesting stories." David felt his pulse quicken. The pieces of a puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture was still unclear. "What year were you in university?" "I started in 2003, Elena said. "I was in my second year when the big group of American students came for the spring semester. There were maybe 15 or 20 of you. You all seemed so excited about everything, even things like buying groceries or figuring out the metro system." "That was us," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Spring semester 2004. I remember there were about 18 American students in our group." Elena's hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes grew wide. 2004, she repeated. "Oh my goodness. You were in Professor Novak's Czech language class, were you not?" David's heart began racing. "Professor Novak with the thick glasses and the terrible jokes?" "Yes, that was my class. 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday mornings. I was the teaching assistant for that class," Elena said, her voice filled with amazement. "I helped Professor Novak with conversation practice and homework corrections. I remember you now. You sat in the 3rd row, always asking questions about grammar rules." The room seemed to spin around David as 20 years of forgotten memories came flooding back. He could suddenly picture Elena clearly, younger, with shorter hair, always carrying a stack of books and wearing that same warm smile. "You helped," Me with my pronunciation, he said, the memories becoming clearer by the second. You were so patient even when I butchered every word. You said my Czech sounded like I had stones in my mouth. Elena laughed out loud, a sound that was exactly as David remembered it. You are not that bad, but yes. American students always had trouble with our consonant clusters. You kept trying so hard, though. You never gave up even when other students got frustrated. You used to meet us at that coffee shop after class, David continued, the memories flowing freely now. What was it called? The one with the red awnings and the old man who made those incredible apple pastries. Café Louvre, Elena said immediately. Mr. Svoboda's place. He closed it about 10 years ago, but back then it was perfect for language practice. I spent so many afternoons there, helping exchange students with their homework and listening to stories about America. David shook his head in disbelief. This is incredible. You were Elena from the coffee shop. You were the one who showed us all those hidden places around the city, the secret gardens and the best viewpoints. And you were David, who was always worried about his grades, Elena said, her smile growing wider. You took everything so seriously, but you also had this wonderful curiosity about everything. You asked a million questions about Czech history, Czech food, Czech traditions. I wanted to understand everything, David said. That semester was supposed to be the adventure of my lifetime. I had big plans to travel all around Europe and maybe even stay longer than the program required. Elena's expression grew more serious. But you left suddenly. One day you were there, asking me about verb conjugations, and the next day Professor Novak told us you had to return to America for a family emergency. David nodded, the happy memories clouded by the sadness of that time. My father had a heart attack. It was very serious, and my mother needed me to come home immediately. I barely had time to pack my belongings and catch the next flight. I remember feeling so sad that you left without saying goodbye, Elena said quietly. All the exchange students became like family to us teaching assistants. When someone left suddenly like that, we always worried and wondered what happened to them. I wanted to say goodbye, David said earnestly. I left a note with Professor Novak asking him to tell everyone, especially you and the other teaching assistants, how much the experience had meant to me. He never gave me any note, Elena said, looking disappointed. Maybe he forgot, or maybe it got lost. Those were busy times at the university. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the amazing coincidence of their reunion. The hotel room felt charged with the energy of rediscovered connection, as if the universe had conspired to bring them back together after all these years. So that is why you looked so familiar when I walked in here, Elena said finally. My subconscious recognized you. Even though we have both changed so much, you have not changed as much as you think, David said with a smile. You still have that same way of tilting your head when you are thinking, and your laugh is exactly the same. Elena blushed slightly and looked down at her hands. 20 years is a long time. A lot has happened since those coffee shop days. Elena looked up from her hands and met David's eyes again. The recognition was complete now, and with it came a flood of emotions neither had expected to feel in a hotel room on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I cannot believe this is really happening, Elena said, shaking her head in wonder. When I woke up this morning, I never imagined I would be sitting here talking to David from the Czech language class. David leaned back in his chair, still trying to process the amazing coincidence. I have thought about that semester so many times over the years. I always wondered what happened to everyone. Professor Novak, the other teaching assistants, my classmates. Professor Novak retired about 5 years ago, Elena said. He lives in a small town outside Prague now, growing vegetables and reading history books. He always said teaching exchange students kept him young, but eventually his wife convinced him to slow down. And what about you? David asked gently. What has life been like for Elena since 2004? Elena was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to share with this person who was both a stranger and an old friend. It has been different from what I expected when I was 22, she said finally. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights below. I finished my literature degree and had big dreams of becoming a famous writer. I thought I would publish novels and travel the world giving readings at bookstores and universities. David could hear a note of sadness in her voice, but also acceptance. Did you pursue writing? He asked. I tried, Elena said, still facing the window. I wrote short stories and submitted them to magazines. I even finished a novel once, but no publisher was interested. The literary world is very difficult, especially for young writers with no connections. She turned back to face him, and David could see strength in her expression, along with the sadness. So I found other work to pay the bills. I have been working at this hotel for about 8 years now. It is honest work, and it has allowed me to support my parents as they get older. Do you still write? David asked. Elena's face brightened a little. Yes, I do. Not as much as I would like, but I have not given up completely. I write in the evenings and on weekends. Small things mostly. Poems, short pieces about life in Prague, stories about the people I meet. David felt a surge of respect for this woman who had held on to her dreams despite disappointments. That takes real courage, he said. It would have been easy to give up completely. Some dreams are too much a part of who you are to abandon, Elena replied. Writing is like breathing for me. Even if no one ever reads what I write, I need to do it for myself. She came back and sat on the bed again, this time more relaxed, as if the conversation had helped her feel more comfortable sharing personal things. What about you, David? Did you become the international business expert you were training to be? David nodded. In a way, yes. I finished my degree and went to work for a consulting company in Chicago. We help businesses expand into new markets, especially in Europe and Asia. So you got to travel after all, Elena observed. Yes, but not in the way I had imagined as a student, David said with a wry smile. Business travel is very different from backpacking around Europe with friends. It is airports and hotels and meeting rooms, not coffee shops and hidden courtyards. Elena studied his face carefully. You sound like someone who has been successful but maybe not completely happy. David was surprised by her insight. He had not expected such a direct observation from someone he had just reconnected with. But Elena had always been perceptive. It was one of the things that made her such a good teaching assistant. You are right, he admitted. I have built a good career and made good money, but something has always felt missing. I think part of me never got over having to leave Prague so suddenly. That semester was supposed to be about discovering who I really was, but it got cut short. And now you are back, Elena said softly. Now I am back, David agreed. Actually, this business trip might lead to something permanent. The company I'm working with wants to open a European headquarters, and Prague is one of the top choices. If the deal goes through, they have offered me the position to run the new office. Elena's eyes widened with interest. You might move back to Prague permanently? It is a real possibility, David said. I have been thinking about it a lot, even before I ran into you tonight. There is something about this city that feels like home to me in a way Chicago never has. Maybe it is because this is where you started to figure out who you really wanted to be, Elena suggested. Even though your time here was cut short, maybe those months were important for shaping who you became. David considered her words. You might be right. I learned so much that semester, not just about business or languages, but about myself. I discovered I loved learning about different cultures, meeting people with different perspectives. You were always curious about everything, Elena remembered. In class, you asked questions that made the rest of us think differently about our own language and culture. You saw things we took for granted with fresh eyes. Being a foreigner does that to you, David said. Everything is new and interesting when you are trying to understand a different way of life. Elena stood up again and began gathering her cleaning supplies. I should probably get back to work, she said reluctantly. I still have several more rooms to finish tonight. David felt a stab of disappointment. The conversation had been the most meaningful he had had in months, and he was not ready for it to end. Will I see you again? He asked, hoping he did not sound too eager. Elena paused in her work and smiled. I work this floor 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday evenings. Same schedule as Professor Novak's old Czech classes. David laughed at the coincidence. Some things never change. Maybe some things are not meant to change, Elena said mysteriously. Maybe some connections are strong enough to survive 20 years and find their way back together. She pushed her cart toward the door, then stopped and looked back at him. David, yes? I am glad the universe decided to give us this second chance to say hello properly. Me too, Elena. Me too. After she left, David sat alone in his hotel room, but the space felt completely different now. It was no longer just a temporary place to sleep between business meetings. It had become the location where an old friendship was reborn, where two people had rediscovered a connection they thought was lost forever. He walked to the window and looked out at Prague's skyline, seeing it now not just as a beautiful city, but as the place where Elena lived and worked and continued to chase her dreams. Somewhere out there in those glowing windows, she would go home after her shift and maybe write a few pages in a notebook, keeping her passion alive despite all the challenges life had thrown at her. David realized that in finding Elena again, he had also found something in himself that had been missing for a long time, the sense of possibility and connection that had made him feel so alive during his student days. Maybe coming back to Prague was not just about a business opportunity. Maybe it was about coming back to the person he was meant to be. The next morning, David woke up with more energy than he had felt in years. The business meetings that had seemed so important yesterday now felt like background noise compared to the amazing coincidence of finding Elena again. He looked at his phone and realized he had been checking the time constantly, waiting for evening to come. His business partner called during breakfast to discuss the merger details, but David found his mind wandering. Instead of focusing on profit margins and expansion strategies, he kept thinking about Elena's stories and the way her eyes lit up when she talked about writing. "David, are you listening?" his partner asked through the phone. "This Prague deal could set us up for the next decade." "Sorry, yes, I am listening," David said, forcing himself to concentrate. The Prague deal. It is very important. But even as he said the words, David realized that Prague had become important to him, for reasons that had nothing to do with business. The city was calling to him in a way it had 20 years ago, when everything seemed possible and every day brought new discoveries. He finished his meetings early that day, telling his colleagues he needed time to explore the city and better understand the local business culture. It was not entirely untrue. He did want to understand Prague better, but not for the reasons they thought. David spent the afternoon walking through the streets where he had once been a student. He found the old dormitory building where he had lived, now renovated with fresh paint and new windows. He walked past the university where Elena had been a teaching assistant, imagining her carrying stacks of papers and helping confused exchange students like himself. The coffee shop where they used to meet was gone, replaced by a modern clothing store. But David could still picture exactly where the tables had been placed and remember the smell of fresh pastries and strong coffee. He wondered if Elena ever walked past this spot and remembered those afternoons too. As evening approached, David returned to his hotel with nervous excitement. He had no idea if Elena would actually appear, or if their amazing reunion had been a one-time coincidence. Maybe she had decided it was too strange to continue conversations with a hotel guest, even one she had known years before. But at exactly the same time as the night before, David heard that familiar soft knock on his door. When he opened it, Elena stood there with her cleaning cart and that same warm smile that had started everything. "Good evening, David," she said, as if greeting an old friend rather than a hotel guest. "How was your day?" "Much better now that you are here," David replied honestly, then felt embarrassed by how eager he sounded. Elena laughed as she entered the room. "I have to admit I was thinking about our conversation all day. It felt like something from a movie, too coincidental to be real." "I know exactly what you mean," David said. "I kept wondering if I had dreamed the whole thing." This time, Elena did not pretend to focus on her work. She set her cleaning supplies aside and sat down in the chair by the window, clearly intending to continue their conversation from where they had left off. "I brought something to show you," she said, pulling a small notebook from her uniform pocket. "These are some of the stories I have been writing. I thought you might like to see what became of that literature student from Professor Novak's class." David felt honored that she trusted him enough to share her writing. "I would love to read them." Elena opened the notebook and began reading aloud. Her voice was soft but confident as she shared a story about an elderly man who fed pigeons in Old Town Square every morning, and how the pigeons had become his only family after his wife passed away. The story was beautiful and sad and hopeful, all at the same time. David found himself transported by Elena's words, seeing Prague through her eyes as someone who had lived there her whole life. and noticed details that tourists and business visitors like himself would never see. "That was incredible," David said when she finished. "You have real talent, Elena. That story made me feel like I was standing right there in the square." Elena blushed with pleasure. "Thank you. Writing has always been my way of making sense of the world around me. Have you ever thought about sharing your work more widely?" David asked. "Maybe starting a blog or submitting to literary magazines again?" "I tried that for a while, but rejection letters can break your spirit if you let them," Elena said. "I decided it was more important to keep writing than to keep getting disappointed by publishers." David admired her resilience, but he also felt sad that someone with such obvious talent had been discouraged from sharing it with the world. What if there were other ways to get your work out there? Ways that did not depend on traditional publishers? Elena looked curious. "What do you mean?" "Well, the internet has changed everything since we were students," David said. "There are websites now where writers can publish their own work and find readers directly. Some writers have built huge audiences that way. I'm not very good with computers and websites," Elena admitted. "The hotel still uses paper schedules and handwritten reports for most things." "I could help you with that," David offered, surprising himself with his eagerness. "I work with technology all the time in my business. Setting up a simple website or blog would be easy." Elena's eyes widened with interest. "You would really do that?" "Of course. Your writing deserves to be read by more people than just hotel guests from Chicago," David said with a smile. They talked for over an hour about Elena's stories and David's ideas for sharing them online. He found himself more animated and excited than he had been in any business meeting. There was something deeply satisfying about using his skills to help someone pursue their passion, rather than just increase corporate profits. "You know," Elena said as their conversation began to wind down, "I have been working at this hotel for 8 years, and I have never met a guest who offered to help me with my writing career. Maybe you have never met a guest who used to sit in the third row of Professor Novak's Czech language class." David replied. Elena laughed. "That must be it." As she prepared to leave, Elena hesitated at the door. "David, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. What really brought you back to Prague? I mean, I know you said it was for business, but there must have been other cities your company could have chosen for expansion." David thought about her question carefully. "I think part of me has been trying to get back here for 20 years, he said finally. "That semester changed something in me, and leaving so suddenly always felt like unfinished business." Elena nodded as if she understood completely. "Some places get into your soul and never leave. And some people do too," David added quietly. Elena smiled at that, a soft expression that reminded David of the young teaching assistant who had been so patient with his terrible pronunciation. "I will see you Thursday." "I would not miss it," David promised. After Elena left, David sat down at his laptop and began researching website platforms and blogging tools. For the first time in years, he was excited about a project that had nothing to do with profit margins or market expansion. He was excited about helping someone else achieve their dreams, and in doing so, maybe rediscovering some of his own forgotten dreams along the way. Thursday evening came faster than David had expected. He had spent the past 2 days thinking constantly about Elena and their conversations. His business meetings had concluded successfully. The Prague office expansion was approved, and he had been officially offered the position to manage it. But somehow, the career opportunity that should have been the highlight of his week felt less important than seeing Elena again. He had spent hours researching the best platforms for writers and had even created a sample website design that he thought she might like. The excitement he felt about showing it to her reminded him of being a student again, eager to share a new discovery with a friend. When Elena's familiar knock came at the door, David opened it immediately. She stood there with her cleaning cart, but this time she was also carrying a small bag over her shoulder. "I brought more of my writing," she announced with a shy smile, "and I also brought some questions about this website idea of yours." David felt his heart lift. "I have been looking forward to this all day." Elena entered and set down her cleaning supplies, but instead of beginning her usual routine, she pulled a thick folder from her bag. "I stayed up late last night gathering some of my favorite pieces," she said. "Stories, poems, even part of that novel I mentioned." "You brought your novel?" David asked, impressed by her trust in sharing something so personal. "Just the first few chapters," Elena said quickly. I am not sure it is any good, but I thought maybe you could tell me if it is worth continuing. They sat down together, Elena in the chair and David on the edge of the bed, as she began sharing more of her work. David was amazed by the variety of her writing. Some pieces were funny observations about hotel guests and city life. Others were deeply emotional stories about family and loss and hope. Elena, this is incredible, David said after she finished reading a particularly moving story about her grandmother's final days. You have such a gift for finding the universal emotions in specific moments. Do you really think so? Elena asked, and David could see how much his opinion meant to her. I know so, he said firmly. These stories make me feel things. They make me see Prague and its people in a completely different way. Elena beamed with happiness. That is exactly what I hope my writing will do. Help people see the beauty and meaning in ordinary life. David pulled out his laptop and showed her the sample website he had created. Look, I made this as an example of how your work could look online. Elena leaned closer to see the screen, and David caught a hint of her perfume, something light and floral that made him think of spring mornings. He had created a simple, elegant design with her name at the top and sections for different types of writing. This is beautiful, Elena said in wonder. You made this for me? It is just a sample, David said modestly. But yes, I thought it might help you visualize how your writing could reach readers all over the world. Elena stared at the screen with fascination. People from other countries could read my stories about Prague? Absolutely. And you could translate some pieces into English to reach even more readers. Your English is excellent, much better than my Czech ever was. Elena laughed at that. You were not so terrible at Czech. You just needed more practice. They spent the next hour going through David's research on writing platforms, online literary magazines, and social media tools for writers. Elena asked thoughtful questions and took careful notes in a small notebook. This is overwhelming, but also exciting, Elena admitted. I feel like you are showing me a door to a room I never knew existed. That is exactly how I felt 20 years ago, when you showed me those hidden courtyards in Prague, David said. You opened my eyes to parts of the city I would never have found on my own. Elena looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. Is that why you are helping me? Because you feel like you owe me something from when we were students? David thought carefully about her question. It was important to be honest. At first, maybe that was part of it, he said. But now it is much more than that. I am helping you because your writing deserves to be shared, and because seeing your passion for it reminds me of what it feels like to care deeply about something. What do you mean? Elena asked softly. I have been successful in business, but I cannot remember the last time I felt truly excited about my work, David explained. These past few days, helping you think about your writing career, I have felt more alive than I have in years. Elena was quiet for a long moment. You know, I have been thinking about what you said about maybe moving back to Prague permanently. And? David asked, his heart beating faster. And I realized that if you do move back, it would not be the same as when we were students, Elena said carefully. We are different people now. We have lived whole lives that the other person does not know about. David felt a flutter of worry. Does that concern you? It does not concern me, Elena said with a smile. It excites me. We get to discover who we have become instead of just remembering who we used to be. David felt relief wash over him. I was worried you might think it was strange. A hotel guest wanting to be involved in your life. You are not just a hotel guest anymore, David, Elena said gently. You have not been since Tuesday night when you asked if we had met before. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights as she had during their previous conversations. Can I tell you something? Of course. When I was assigned to work the 7th floor this week, I almost asked to switch with another staff member, Elena said. Business guests can be demanding, and I was feeling tired from working double shifts. What changed your mind? David asked. Elena turned back to face him. I had a feeling, just a strange intuition that something important was going to happen up here. I almost ignored it, but something told me to trust that feeling. I am glad you did, David said quietly. Me too, Elena replied, because now I have to make a decision. What kind of decision? Elena took a deep breath. Tomorrow is my last shift at the hotel. David felt his stomach drop. You are leaving? I am quitting, Elena said with a mixture of nervousness and determination. I have been thinking about it for months, but our conversations this week finally gave me the courage to do it. But why? David asked, confused. Elena smiled, and it was the brightest, most confident smile he had seen from her yet. Because I want to be a writer, not a hotel housekeeper who writes in her spare time. I have some savings, and my parents said they would help me if I need it. I decided to take 6 months and focus completely on my writing. David felt amazed by her courage. Elena, that is incredible. I am so proud of you for taking that leap. I could not have done it without these conversations with you, Elena said. You reminded me that dreams are worth pursuing even when they seem impossible. What will you do first? David asked. First, I want to learn more about this website idea of yours, Elena said with a grin. And then I want to finish that novel and start submitting my stories to magazines again. David felt a surge of excitement. I am supposed to fly back to Chicago on Sunday, but I could extend my stay for a few more days to help you get started. Elena's eyes lit up. You would do that? Elena, helping you launch your writing career would be the most meaningful thing I have done in years, David said honestly. She walked over and sat down next to him on the bed. And what about this job offer in Prague? Have you made a decision? David looked into her eyes and realized that his decision had been made the moment she walked into his room 3 days ago. Yes, I have. I am going to take it. Really? Elena asked, her voice full of joy. Really? It turns out Prague still has more to teach me, and I am finally ready to learn. Elena reached out and took his hand, just as she had on Tuesday night. But this time the gesture felt like a promise rather than a greeting. Welcome back to Prague, David, she said softly. It is good to be home, Elena, he replied, and for the first time in 20 years he truly meant it.